Did the Somali used to read and write before colonial time? That's the question I'm going to explore in this video. And I'm going to look at examples that tell us the possibility of the writings before colonization. And but also we are going to acknowledge the reality of the Horn of Africa, and which applies, of course, to the rest of Africa before the colonial time. Now, when that question is asked, some people might just go straight to saying no, the Somalis did not write, and the same answer applies to the rest of East Africa. Some people will say yes, but the answer, of course, is like many questions. The answer is a little bit more complex than that. Now, when you read documents like a book written by H.G.C. Swain, he mentions learning centers in the Horn of Africa. He mentions, of course, Harare is the obvious one that everybody knows, that people used to go to Harare to learn how to read and write. And in fact, Sir Richard Burton talks about meeting some individuals in Harare in 1850s who had their own book collections, which I found to be very interesting. So at least we could say that side people used to read and write. And then there were other settlements like Hargeisa, and there are others that are mentioned by people like Swain, even as far in as Ogaden, where you will have these small settlements where people were reading and writing. Also, when you go to the southern part of Somalia, Christopher Wilmot, Christopher Lieutenant, mentions in 1840s that there were these settlements, for example, the Bardere settlement that was fought by the Sultan of Geledi, where they focused a lot more on reading and writing and studying. So we could say there were those settlements where people learned how to read and write. But by and large, the general population most likely was not, but that's not just a Somali issue, really. It's a human issue, because sometimes we forget that even in Europe, up until maybe 300 years ago or 400 years ago, the average person did not know how to read and write. That was a preserve of maybe priests and scholars, and this was very small class of people in the society. So the same case it was in the Horn of Africa, that there were people who knew how to read and write, but the average person, it wasn't really necessary for them to know how to read and write. And but still there are examples of the ordinary person having something written. For example, I think they are called the amulets, or what they are called. These are religious texts that are written, and then people wear them and carry them with them for good luck. That used to be so common among the Somalis in the, we could say at least in the 19th century, and we can assume that went on for a very long time. Now, I'm going to look at 4 examples of notable writers from the Somali society, and I'm going to start from the more or less more recent, and then we go back. Now, there's somebody who wrote a document titled Al-Hariri al-Risala al-Siniya. This was a document that was published in 1692. Turns out this individual was a Somali, and his name was Muhammad ibn Mumin ibn Adam al-Laikasi al-Shafi. And he was a scholar. He came from the Laikasi lineage. He was based in what we know today as Central Somalia, Galdogob area. And the book he wrote was a grammar and philosophy commentary on a literary showpiece by the 11th. So he was kind of like writing a commentary on work that was written by another person. So this is a document that appeared in the, we could say, 17th century. So that's a long time ago. Now, the next example is a document, Takrij Ahadith al-Kashaf. This was written by one Jamal Din al-Zailai, which means he came from Zaila. Now, while I don't have the exact time this was written, it clearly was written earlier than the 17th century. So it's an older document. The gentleman was also a Somali from Zaila. Then there is another document titled Nasaba Rayad al-Ahadith al-Hadiya. This was published, could be 1360, that is 14th century, written by somebody Jamal al-Din Abu Muhammad Abdullah ibn Yusuf al-Zailai. I think it's the same person who wrote the other document that I mentioned. So the other document could also have been written around the 14th century. He was also a Somali from Zaila. And this gentleman is a very interesting individual, because while he came from Zaila, seems like he traveled a lot. And at some point, he taught in Cairo and Damascus. He was a professor. And he wrote mostly on legal matters. Seems like he was a very well learned individual. There is also another example of Tabiin al-Haqa'iq Shakri Kazaldagaik. I might pronounce the title not in the way that it should because that's Arabic. This was written by one Vakr al-Adin Uthman ibn Ali al-Zaila, also came from Zaila, also from the 14th century, 1332. He taught at Al-Hazar. That is in Egypt. He was also in Egypt, seems to have traveled a lot. His works are notable, at least they are notable in history. So these are examples of writings by Somali authors before colonial times. So they used to write clearly. Now, there's something interesting that you realize when you start investigating this issue, and that is most of them used to write in Arabic. That could be interesting because there is a likelihood they did write in Somali language. But why Arabic? I think it just has to do with reaching a large audience. Arabic was an international language. Most of the old world of the most learned people spoke Arabic, or that's how documents were consumed. And in fact, even Jewish writers actually used to write in Arabic, which is very interesting. Maimonides, for example, used to write his works in Arabic because in the old world, we could say maybe beginning 11th century, most highly learned people used to have discourses in the Arabic language. Sometimes that fact is lost. So they might have had to write in Arabic. It's like today, most of us choose in Africa, for example, choose to write in English, in French. It's not because we don't love our languages, but because if you write in English, then you have a wider audience, then you are able to have your ideas consumed far and wide. I think that's what used to happen. So did the Somali used to write before colonial time? Yes, they did. They did write. It seems like there are some people who came from the lands of the Somalis who went ahead and achieved a lot and became very successful, very respectable scholars. And even those who are not actually scholars per se, they also wrote. And then some did not actually write, but you cannot discount their ideas because they were not written, especially considering that the Somali society was a society that liked and cherished oral literature a lot, especially poetry. And through that, poetry was not just entertainment, it was a way to preserve history and to preserve culture. So we cannot discount that society simply because so maybe they did not write as much as we write today, but they did have their way of preserving things like through poetry, of course. And then there are people who generated poetry while they did not write themselves. Those poetry have later on been written. For example, Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, the dervish leader, he did a lot of poetry that later on people are publishing or writing in books. And he's not alone. There are so many others who that's the path that has been taken with their work. So yeah, so two things. They did write. Number two, there was other ways that information and knowledge was preserved besides writing, and poetry is one of those that stand out the most. Check my book reading list in the pinned comment and description box. And if you are watching on TikTok, check on my profile bio. Those are my random thoughts.